The moment he said, "Step aside, ma'am," no one in that building realized they were speaking to the woman who already owned it all. Madison Brooks paused at the glass entrance of the Meridian Executive Center, her expression calm, her appearance deliberately simple. A plain white blouse tucked neatly into tailored black slacks. Nothing about her suggesting power, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Inside, the marble lobby stretched wide beneath soft golden lighting, filled with executives moving with rushed importance, phones pressed to ears, voices layered in constant urgency. Jason Whitman, head of security, noticed her immediately and frowned as she approached the restricted corridor leading to upper management floors. He stepped forward with practiced authority, blocking her path with a polite but dismissive gesture. "Step aside, ma'am," he said firmly, glancing at her outfit as if it explained everything he needed to know. "This area is for executives only." Madison stopped, not startled, not offended, just observant, her eyes briefly scanning the security badge on his chest, then the camera above the entrance, then the flow of employees passing without a second glance at her. "I'm here for a scheduled review," she replied evenly. Jason gave a short, humorless breath, already deciding she didn't belong. Behind him, Olivia Grant, the floor manager, approached with a clipboard in hand, her expression tightening as she assessed Madison from head to toe. "There's no appointment listed under your name," Olivia said, flipping through her schedule without looking up for long. "If you're here for general inquiries, reception is downstairs." Madison didn't react to the subtle dismissal. Instead, she simply reached into her small leather folder and pulled out a single card, placing it gently on the counter. Olivia glanced at it briefly, then paused. The name printed on it meant nothing to her at first, just another visitor entry, until her eyes narrowed slightly, as if something about it felt off but not yet clear enough to challenge. Jason leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough for authority to feel heavier than words. "People sometimes think they can walk into corporate floors without understanding how things work here," he said. "I suggest you don't make this difficult." A few nearby employees slowed their steps, sensing tension but not intervening, the familiar comfort of hierarchy silently guiding their indifference. Madison's gaze shifted past them, toward the glass wall overlooking the entire operation floor below, where hundreds of employees worked under systems she had personally approved years ago. She studied the rhythm of the place like someone reviewing a familiar design that had drifted slightly out of alignment. Olivia finally typed something into her system, waiting, then frowned at the screen, uncertainty beginning to replace confidence. Jason, still focused on control, motioned subtly toward the exit corridor. "We can resolve this quietly," he said. "No need to escalate embarrassment." Madison finally looked at him directly, not with anger, not with frustration, but with a quiet clarity that made him hesitate for half a second without understanding why. "You're right," she said softly. "It doesn't need to be escalated." For a brief moment, Jason almost relaxed, interpreting her tone as compliance. But then she added one more sentence, calm and precise, without raising her voice. "Call Richard Coleman." The name landed differently. Olivia stopped typing. Jason blinked once, then let out a faint, dismissive smile, as if she had just said something irrelevant. "Mr. Coleman doesn't take walk-ins," he replied. Madison didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply stood still, her presence unchanged, her patience absolute, as if she had all the time in the world while the entire building, unaware, had just begun moving closer to a moment it would not be able to undo. Jason Whitman let out a quiet breath through his nose, the kind of sound people make when they believe a situation is already decided in their favor. He tilted his head slightly, exchanging a brief glance with Olivia Grant, who still stood behind the counter with her hand resting on the keyboard, waiting for a name she assumed would lead nowhere. "Calling Mr. Coleman will not change the policy," Jason said calmly, his tone softened, now as if he was explaining something obvious to someone inexperienced. Madison Brooks remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral in a way that made it impossible to read agreement or resistance. Around them, the executive lobby continued its rhythm, phones ringing, footsteps echoing across polished marble, people moving with purpose without noticing the quiet tension forming near the entrance corridor. Olivia finally exhaled and tapped the name into the internal directory system, expecting a standard rejection or at most a delayed transfer to an assistant. Instead, the screen paused for a fraction longer than usual before refreshing with a different classification layer she did not immediately recognize. Her eyebrows tightened slightly as she leaned closer to the monitor. Jason noticed her hesitation and gave a faint, dismissive smile. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound considerate rather than condescending, "we can still resolve it without unnecessary escalation." Madison did not respond to him. Her attention shifted briefly toward the glass elevator at the far end of the lobby, where employees in dark suits moved between floors without pause, unaware of the small administrative ripple forming at the entrance. Olivia clicked again, this time slower, her expression shifting from mild skepticism to subtle confusion as the system returned an internal alert linked to executive clearance access. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "This name is showing restricted internal flag status," she said, more to herself than to Jason or Madison. Jason frowned slightly, stepping closer to the screen. "That is not possible without board verification," he replied immediately, confidence still intact but now carrying a slight edge. Olivia nodded uncertainly, already reaching for the internal communication line, her fingers hovering before pressing the call button to executive coordination. A moment later, a voice answered from the other end, professional and immediate, asking for identification details. Olivia gave Madison's name again, spelling it carefully, and the silence that followed on the line felt longer than it should have been. Jason crossed his arms, watching now with a faint impatience returning to his stance. Madison remained quiet, her gaze steady, as if none of this required her participation yet. Then the voice on the other end changed tone slightly, becoming more alert, asking Olivia to repeat the name again. After a brief pause, the line went silent for 2 seconds before a new instruction came through. "Hold the line and transfer immediately to Executive Board Liaison." Olivia blinked once, visibly unsettled now, and Jason's expression shifted for the first time into something less certain. The atmosphere in the lobby subtly changed, not through movement but through attention, as nearby staff began to notice that something was no longer routine. Olivia's hand moved quickly now, transferring the call through a secured internal channel. Jason leaned slightly toward Madison, lowering his voice. "If this is an attempt to bypass protocol," he said carefully, "it will not be received well by upper management." Madison finally turned her head toward him, meeting his gaze directly, not with confrontation, but with quiet certainty that did not require explanation. "Protocol is already aware of me," she said softly. At that exact moment, Olivia straightened abruptly as the call connected, her posture shifting into immediate professionalism as she handed over the line. The voice that came through was different, deeper in authority, and immediately alert. "This is Richard Coleman," the voice said. "Why is this name being flagged at Security Level 1 clearance?" The air in the lobby seemed to tighten slightly, as Jason Whitman's expression slowly began to lose its earlier confidence, replaced by the first trace of uncertainty he had shown all day, while Madison Brooks simply waited, as if the next response was already something she had known would arrive. The silence on the executive line stretched for a moment too long, the kind of silence that changes the temperature of a room without anyone physically noticing it. Olivia Grant held the phone closer to her ear, her eyes fixed on the screen as if it might suddenly rearrange itself into something more understandable. Jason Whitman stood slightly behind her now, no longer relaxed, his arms uncrossed without him realizing it. His attention locked on the subtle shift in the atmosphere. On the other end of the line, Richard Coleman repeated his question, his tone no longer neutral but sharpened with immediate concern. "I asked why this name is triggering a Security Level 1 clearance alert," he said again, slower this time, as if the system itself had made a mistake too serious to ignore. Olivia swallowed before responding, carefully choosing each word. "Sir, the individual is currently at the main executive entrance requesting access for a scheduled review," she said. There was a brief pause before Richard Coleman responded, his voice lowering slightly, now carrying the weight of recognition beginning to surface. "Put her on the line," he said simply. Olivia hesitated for only a fraction of a second before extending the phone toward Madison Brooks with both hands, her posture subtly changing from control to uncertainty. Jason stepped forward instinctively, as if to intervene, but stopped halfway when Madison calmly accepted the phone without urgency. The moment she brought it to her ear, the background noise of the lobby seemed to fade just slightly, as though the building itself was paying attention. "This is Madison," she said calmly. On the other end, there was another pause, longer this time, followed by the faint sound of papers shifting and a chair adjusting. Richard Coleman's voice returned, but now the authority in it had shifted into something more cautious. "Miss Brooks," he said, carefully enunciating her name, "your clearance was not flagged in today's entry logs. That should not be possible unless there was a system override or direct board authorization." Jason Whitman frowned at those words, exchanging a quick glance with Olivia, whose fingers hovered uncertainly above the keyboard, as if she no longer trusted what the system was showing her. Madison's expression remained steady, her voice unchanged. "There was a scheduled operational review for this facility," she said, "confirmed 3 weeks ago through board-level coordination." Another silence. Followed, this one heavier, more deliberate, as Richard Coleman processed the statement. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted into something that no longer carried doubt but careful alignment. "Stay where you are," he said. "Do not leave the entrance area. I am pulling up the board confirmation now." Jason Whitman's jaw tightened slightly, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible recalibration. He looked toward Olivia, who had gone pale enough for her professional composure to begin slipping. The lobby, once indifferent, now felt subtly reorganized by attention alone, with passing employees slowing their steps just enough to notice that something at the entrance had reached a level beyond routine protocol. Madison lowered the phone slightly but did not end the call, waiting as instructed. Olivia leaned closer to Jason, speaking quietly for the first time without certainty. "Security Level 1 clearance is reserved for executive board verification only," she said. Jason did not respond immediately. His eyes were now fixed on Madison, not with dismissal, but with the first trace of recalculation that something fundamental about his assumption had been wrong from the beginning. The phone in Madison's hand remained active, and from it came the faint sound of keyboard typing and system access logs being reviewed at a level far above the lobby they stood in. After several seconds, Richard Coleman's voice returned again, but this time there was no confusion left in it, only controlled urgency. "Stand by," he said. "Board confirmation is matching your credentials." The words settled into the space between them like a quiet shift in gravity. Jason Whitman finally straightened fully, no longer certain of his earlier authority, while Olivia slowly lowered her gaze to the system screen that was now updating in real time, reflecting access permissions she had never seen activated before. Madison remained still, holding the phone, as the building around her continued to operate, unaware that its hierarchy had just begun to realign itself in real time. The moment the system update finished synchronizing, the atmosphere in the executive lobby shifted in a way that was not visible but deeply felt by everyone standing within it. Olivia Grant stared at her monitor as new access permissions populated across multiple secure layers, each one unlocking administrative pathways she had never seen activated in her entire career at Meridian Executive Center. Jason Whitman stood motionless for a brief second, his eyes scanning the same screen, now showing clearance confirmations that bypassed every standard protocol he had spent years enforcing. On the phone, Richard Coleman exhaled slowly, his voice now completely stripped of confusion and replaced with controlled urgency. "Confirmed," he said, the single word carrying more weight than anything else spoken that day. Olivia blinked, her voice hesitant as she responded, "Sir, should I proceed with executive escort protocol?" There was a brief pause before Richard answered, "Negative. Stand down all security escalation. She is authorized at full board level access." The word board caused Jason Whitman to visibly stiffen, his posture shifting as if the floor beneath him had subtly changed. He turned his head slightly toward Madison Brooks, who still stood with calm precision, holding the phone without any sign of urgency or satisfaction. Only quiet certainty, as if the outcome had already been known long before anyone else had begun to question it. Olivia slowly lowered her hand from the keyboard, her professional composure now fractured by uncertainty, and for the first time she looked directly at Madison not as a visitor but as something she had completely miscategorized from the beginning. Jason cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation through protocol, but his voice no longer carried authority. "There must be an error in classification," he said carefully, though even he could hear the doubt embedded in his own words. On the phone, Richard Coleman responded immediately, his tone sharper now, final and unambiguous. "There is no error," he said. "Madison Brooks is listed as Chief Executive Officer, Brooks Meridian Holdings, and primary board authority for all regional operations." The words settled into the lobby like a structural collapse happening without sound. Olivia's hand slowly moved away from the system entirely, as if touching it further might reinforce the mistake she had already made. Jason Whitman felt his earlier confidence dissolve completely, replaced by a quiet realization that every assumption he had made in the past several minutes had been built on incomplete information. Around them, the executive staff who had continued their routines began to slow, sensing the shift in energy without fully understanding its source. Madison finally lowered the phone from her ear and ended the call with a simple motion, placing it back into her folder with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. She looked toward Jason first, then Olivia, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a steady clarity that required no emotional display. Jason stepped back half a step without realizing it, his earlier command presence now replaced with a stillness that came from uncertainty rather than authority. Olivia swallowed, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "We were not informed of your visit details," she said, though the words sounded less like an explanation and more like an attempt to understand where everything had gone wrong. Madison's gaze moved past them toward the executive floors above, where decisions affecting thousands of employees were made daily without personal visibility. "That is why I am here," she said calmly. The simplicity of her response carried more weight than any correction or reprimand could have. Jason nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement of a hierarchy he now fully recognized but no longer controlled. Olivia stepped aside instinctively, her body language shifting into immediate deference as the reality of the situation fully registered. Madison adjusted the strap of her folder, her expression unchanged, and began walking forward toward the restricted corridor, not hurried, not slow, but deliberate in a way that made the entire lobby feel as if it had been recalibrated around her presence. Behind her, Jason Whitman and Olivia Grant remained silent, watching as the woman they had attempted to redirect now moved through the space with unquestioned access, leaving behind an atmosphere that had permanently changed without a single raised voice. Madison Brooks stepped into the private executive elevator without hesitation, her access card already validated before she even reached the panel, and the doors closed smoothly behind her with a soft mechanical sound that felt unusually final in the quiet of the lobby below. Jason Whitman stood frozen near the security desk, watching the ascent indicator light move upward floor by floor, his earlier confidence completely replaced by a heavy silence he could not quite process into words. Olivia Grant remained at her station, her hands no longer moving, her eyes fixed on the updated clearance profile still displayed on her monitor, now marked with full board authorization and executive override privileges that extended across all regional operations. Neither of them spoke for several seconds, as if any sound might make the reality more permanent. As the elevator moved upward through the glass tower, Madison stood still, her reflection faint against the polished interior walls, her expression unchanged, calm, focused, as if she were simply reviewing a familiar environment rather than entering a space that had just redefined itself around her presence. Each floor passed with quiet precision, executive departments, financial oversight divisions, strategic planning units, all continuing their work unaware that the person responsible for final governance decisions was now arriving in person. On the 42nd floor, a senior analyst paused mid-conversation as a system alert briefly flashed across his secondary screen, indicating executive override activation from the board level, but before he could process it, The alert disappeared into secured confirmation status. On the ground floor, Jason finally exhaled, rubbing his hand across his face in a slow motion that suggested disbelief rather than fatigue. "We just stopped her at the entrance," he said quietly, more to himself than to Olivia, who did not respond immediately. Olivia swallowed before speaking, her voice lower than before. "We did not recognize her authorization profile," she said, though the words now sounded less like justification and more like acknowledgement of an irreversible oversight. Jason nodded once, but there was no confidence in the motion. "That was not supposed to be possible," he replied. Meanwhile, at the top level of the building, the elevator doors opened directly into a restricted executive corridor lined with glass walls and muted lighting, leading toward the central board conference suite. Madison stepped forward without pause, her footsteps steady on the polished floor, passing assistants and executive staff who all paused briefly as their internal systems synchronized her presence in real time. A few employees straightened instinctively, others simply stepped aside, recognizing the shift in authority without needing verbal confirmation. At the far end of the corridor, the double doors to the board suite were already open. Richard Coleman stood inside the room, his posture controlled but visibly different from earlier, no longer operating from assumption but from verified recognition. Several senior board members were seated around a long table, their attention shifting toward the entrance as Madison approached. The atmosphere inside the room carried a different weight than the lobby below, quieter, more concentrated, shaped by decisions rather than procedures. Richard Coleman stepped forward slightly, his voice measured. "Madison," he said, acknowledging her arrival formally now. She stopped just inside the doorway, not advancing further, not retreating, simply present. The room remained silent for a moment as multiple executives absorbed the situation that had escalated from a routine access verification into full board-level engagement. One of the board members glanced briefly at Richard, then back at Madison, as if confirming reality against internal expectation. Richard continued, his tone steady but careful. "There was a failure in front-line recognition protocol," he said. "It has already been flagged for immediate review." Madison listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her attention not on apology but on alignment. After a brief pause, she spoke clearly, her voice calm but carrying enough weight to settle the room. "Further, protocol is not the issue," she said. "Execution consistency is." The statement was not loud, yet it shifted the atmosphere more than any correction or explanation could have. Richard nodded once, acknowledging the distinction without argument. Around the table, executives adjusted their posture subtly, realizing that the conversation was no longer about access but about operational accountability at the highest level. Madison finally stepped forward into the room, not as an intruder, not as a visitor, but as someone whose presence had already been confirmed by every system they relied on. And as she took her place at the head of the discussion space, the building below continued to operate, now permanently aware that authority had already been present long before anyone recognized it. Inside the executive board suite, the air felt different from the rest of the building, not because of luxury or design, but because every person present understood that decisions made in this room were not interpretive, they were final. Madison Brooks stood near the head of the long table, her presence steady, her hands resting lightly on the edge of a document folder that had been placed there moments earlier by an assistant who now stood respectfully at a distance. Richard Coleman remained standing to her right, no longer speaking, as if his earlier explanations had already served their purpose and now silence was the appropriate form of acknowledgement. Around the table, several senior board members reviewed updated system logs on their tablets, each one displaying the same sequence of events from the executive center entrance, the clearance request, the initial denial, and the immediate override authorization that had triggered full escalation protocol. One of the board members, an older man with a calm but analytical expression, finally broke the silence. "The frontline response did not align with executive identification standards," he said, not as a question but as a procedural observation. Madison looked toward him briefly before responding. "The issue was not identification," she said evenly. "It was assumption." The word settled into the room without resistance. Richard Coleman nodded slightly, acknowledging the distinction. Assumption is being addressed at the operational level, he replied. Security teams have already been instructed to undergo recalibration training for clearance recognition protocols. Madison did not immediately respond. Instead, she looked across the table at the system summary reports, scanning data that reflected thousands of daily interactions across multiple facilities. Her expression remained composed, but her focus was precise, as if isolating structural inefficiencies rather than reacting to a single incident. Below them, in the executive center lobby, Jason Whitman remained standing near the security desk, now no longer speaking at all, his attention fixed on the internal communication terminal that continued to update with cascading confirmation notices. Olivia Grant sat slightly behind him, her posture still, her screen now showing full audit flags for procedural misclassification, with a mandatory review notice already scheduled for her department. Jason finally spoke after a long pause, his voice quieter than before. "We treated her like she did not belong here," he said. Olivia did not look at him immediately. When she finally did, her response was careful. "We did not have complete information," she said, though the phrasing no longer carried certainty. Jason shook his head slightly. "We had enough information," he replied. The silence that followed between them was heavier than any argument. Back upstairs, Richard Coleman gestured subtly toward the screen displaying operational impact metrics. "The immediate concern is not access failure alone," he said. "It is the confidence degradation in front-line recognition of executive authority." Madison turned her attention toward him, her expression unchanged. "Confidence degradation is a symptom," she said, "not the cause." The board members around the table exchanged brief glances, understanding the implication without needing elaboration. One of them spoke carefully. "Then the cause must be corrected at structural level." Madison nodded once. "Structural correction requires consistency between policy and execution," she said, "not interpretation at entry points." Richard Coleman acknowledged this with a measured nod. "We will initiate full system-wide protocol reinforcement," he said. Madison finally moved from her position at the table, walking slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the city below. The skyline stretched outward in clean geometric lines, reflecting the controlled structure of the organization she oversaw. She paused there for a moment, not in contemplation of the view, but in evaluation of the system behind it. Behind her, the boardroom remained silent, waiting not for permission, but for direction that would define the next operational phase. Madison spoke without turning around. "No individual at the operational level should ever be required to guess authority again," she said. Her voice remained calm, but its impact was absolute. Richard Coleman responded immediately. "Understood," he said. "We will remove ambiguity from all access hierarchies." Madison nodded slightly, still facing the city. "Then the system will no longer fail at recognition," she said. The room remained quiet, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement that the structure of authority had just been reaffirmed in a way that required no further debate. Below them, the building continued its operations, now adjusting silently to a corrected understanding of who had always been in control. The boardroom remained still after Madison Brooks finished speaking, not because there was uncertainty, but because every executive present understood that what had just been stated was no longer a suggestion but a directive that would shape every operational layer of the organization moving forward. Richard Coleman stood near the glass wall, watching as system analytics continued updating in real time across multiple screens, each one reflecting adjustments being pushed through global access protocols. He finally spoke with a controlled voice that carried both respect and urgency. "We will initiate a full compliance restructuring across all executive facilities within 72 hours, he said. Madison did not turn around immediately. Her attention remained on the city outside, where thousands of employees moved through systems that now depended on accuracy rather than assumption. After a brief pause, she responded calmly. 72 hours is acceptable for system correction, she said. It is not acceptable for behavioral inconsistency. The statement caused a subtle shift among the board members, not of disagreement, but of recognition that leadership accountability extended beyond software and into human execution. Richard nodded once. Then we will accelerate training protocols for all frontline operational staff, he said. Madison finally turned back toward the table. Her expression remained composed, but her focus was precise. Training alone does not resolve pattern-based misclassification, she said. Recognition systems must reflect real authority, not perceived expectation. No one interrupted her. The room absorbed the statement as operational truth rather than opinion. Below them, in the executive center lobby, Jason Whitman remained standing in the same position, though his posture had changed from defensive to reflective. Olivia Grant had reopened her system dashboard, now reviewing audit logs that showed exactly where recognition failure had occurred, each step highlighted in automated correction markers. Jason finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. We did not question her access because of policy, he said slowly. We questioned it because of appearance-based assumption. Olivia nodded slightly, not defending the behavior, but acknowledging it. That assumption is now logged as a critical training failure, she replied. Jason exhaled, looking toward the entrance where Madison had originally been stopped, as if the memory of the moment now carried a different weight than it had minutes earlier. She never raised her voice, he said. Olivia looked up briefly. She did not need to, she replied. At that same moment, upstairs in the board suite, Richard Coleman received a final system confirmation on his tablet. He glanced at it, then spoke with a measured tone. All executive clearance hierarchies have been updated to reflect direct board validation protocols, he said. Madison gave a slight nod, acknowledging completion. Without emphasis. Good, she said simply. She then stepped away from the glass wall and walked back toward the center of the room, where the board members now sat with full attention aligned. Operational integrity is not defined by reaction speed, she continued. It is defined by correct recognition at first contact. Her words were not delivered as correction, but as structural principle. The room remained silent for a moment, absorbing the finality of that distinction. Richard Coleman then spoke again, more formally this time. We will implement direct escalation pathways for all ambiguous clearance cases, he said. Madison looked at him briefly, then nodded once. Ensure there are no ambiguous cases, she replied. The simplicity of the statement carried its own authority. No one in the room attempted to reinterpret it. Down in the lobby, Jason Whitman finally stepped back from the security desk, his earlier authority now replaced with a quieter awareness of responsibility. Olivia closed her system interface and stood as well, both of them now no longer reacting to what had happened, but recalibrating to what it meant moving forward. The executive center continued operating as before, but every system, every protocol, and every assumption had already begun shifting toward a corrected structure that no longer relied on appearance, but on verified truth. The executive board suite remained quiet for several seconds after Madison Brooks finished speaking, not because there was confusion, but because every person in the room was processing the finality of what structural correction truly meant when spoken at her level of authority. Richard Coleman stood slightly back from the table now, his hands resting behind him in a posture that had shifted from executive command to measured acknowledgement. On the central display wall, system-wide updates continued to refresh, showing that revised recognition protocols were already propagating across multiple regional facilities, including the Meridian Executive Center where the initial incident had occurred. One board member finally spoke, his tone careful and respectful. All regional executive centers will require synchronized implementation to prevent future inconsistency, he said. Madison Brooks nodded once, her expression unchanged. Consistency is not achieved through synchronization alone, she replied. It is achieved through accountability at every point of contact. The room absorbed her words without interruption, each executive understanding that the correction being discussed was no longer theoretical but operationally binding. Richard Coleman stepped forward slightly. We will assign direct oversight teams to monitor implementation across all access layers, he said. Madison turned slightly toward him. Oversight must include behavioral evaluation, not just system compliance, she said. There was a brief pause before Richard responded. Understood, he said. We will integrate both metrics into the audit framework. Madison gave a subtle nod, then shifted her attention back toward the glass wall overlooking the city. The skyline stretched across the horizon, calm and structured. Yet beneath that calm lay millions of daily interactions dependent on accuracy at every level. She observed it for a moment before speaking again. Every organization believes its systems are reliable until the first incorrect assumption goes unchallenged, she said quietly. The statement carried across the room with precision, not as warning, but as established truth. Below them, in the executive center lobby, Jason Whitman and Olivia Grant stood near the security desk in a silence that was no longer tense, but reflective. Jason finally spoke, his voice lower than before. We did not challenge her authority, he said. We failed to recognize it. Olivia nodded slowly. And the failure occurred before any system verification was checked, she added. Jason exhaled, glancing toward the entrance corridor where Madison had originally been stopped earlier that day. The memory now felt structurally different, as if it belonged to a previous version of the building's operational identity. She did not correct us, Jason said. She simply revealed what we missed. Olivia looked at him briefly. That is why the correction is permanent, she replied. Upstairs, in the board suite, Richard Coleman received another system update on his tablet. He reviewed it briefly, then spoke with controlled clarity. All executive access points now require dual-layer verification between identity recognition and authority registry, he said. Madison turned back toward the table. Ensure that verification does not delay recognition, she said. Richard nodded immediately. It will be optimized for real-time processing, he replied. Madison's gaze moved across the board members once more. Recognition must never depend on assumption, she said. It must depend on confirmation. The room remained silent, not from uncertainty, but from alignment. Every executive present understood that the structure they were now operating under had shifted from interpretive judgment to verified authority. Downstairs, Jason Whitman stepped away from the security desk completely. His role no longer centered on enforcement, but on understanding the system he was responsible for upholding. Olivia closed her terminal and followed a moment later, both of them moving with the quiet awareness that the incident earlier that day had permanently redefined their perception of access and authority. The executive center continued functioning, unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally recalibrated in operation, as every system, every protocol, and every interaction adjusted silently to a corrected hierarchy that no longer allowed assumption to override truth. The executive center had returned to its normal rhythm by late afternoon, yet nothing about it felt the same to those who understood what had changed beneath its surface. Employees moved through the marble corridors with professional focus, but conversations were quieter, more deliberate, as if an invisible adjustment had been applied to the way authority was perceived inside the building. At the entrance level, Jason Whitman stood near the security station once more, no longer as an enforcer of access but as someone reviewing the structure he had once enforced without question. Olivia Grant joined him shortly after, holding a printed system summary report that detailed the full protocol adjustments implemented across all executive access layers. Neither of them spoke immediately. The weight of the day was no longer in the event itself, but in the realization of how easily assumption had replaced verification in their previous decisions. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice steady but reflective. We treated recognition as appearance instead of verification, he said. Olivia nodded, her eyes scanning the report. And the correction replaced interpretation with confirmation, she replied. Upstairs, in the executive suite, Madison Brooks stood once again near the glass wall, looking out over the city as the sun shifted lower in the sky, casting long structured reflections across the buildings below. Richard Coleman approached her position but stopped at a respectful distance, no longer speaking as a subordinate or coordinator, but as someone acknowledging final authority. All systems have been updated to reflect the new access framework, he said. Madison did not turn immediately. Her attention remained on the city, where millions of daily interactions continued under systems that now aligned more precisely with verified identity rather than perceived expectation. After a moment, she spoke. A system is only as reliable as its first point of recognition, she said calmly. Richard nodded. That principle has now been embedded into every regional protocol, he replied. Madison finally turned slightly toward him. Then failure will no longer originate from identity, she said. It will only originate from process. Richard acknowledged this with a single nod, understanding that the distinction marked the completion of the restructuring phase. Inside the boardroom behind them, executives began gathering their materials, preparing to transition from correction review to operational continuity, each of them aware that the events of the day would now be part of standard training case documentation. Down in the lobby, Jason and Olivia reviewed the final section of the system report together. A line item confirmed that all frontline personnel would undergo revised training focused on authority recognition, elimination of assumption-based escalation, and immediate validation protocols for executive clearance requests. Jason read it quietly before speaking. This is going to change how every interaction is handled here, he said. Olivia responded without hesitation. It already has, she said. Jason looked toward the entrance once more, recalling the moment when a simple instruction to step aside had marked the beginning of everything that followed. Now, that same space felt different, not because of fear or tension, but because clarity had replaced uncertainty. We will not make that mistake again, Jason said. Olivia nodded once. We will not have the option to, she replied. Above them, Madison Brooks stepped away from the glass wall and returned toward the center of the executive suite. The board members rose slightly as she approached, not out of formality alone, but out of recognition of alignment between leadership and structure.